there are too many women in positions of power and influence. That's the core argument Helen Andrews makes here in this piece called The Great Feminization. She's basically arguing that women have reached parity in a number of institutions, whether that's boardrooms or the Supreme Court or the legal system. There are too many women in positions of power. And because of that, they are imposing a feminine culture into how business gets done. And this is what she attributes to the rise of wokeness, or this new mandate that we're experiencing in society right now to build consensus and accommodate all sorts of different types of people, regardless of whether or not we agree with them or align with them. So let's dive into this piece. So she opens it up by talking about Larry Summers. He was the president at Harvard, and he stepped down after he made some comments that basically made the argument that men and women are different, and there are some areas where men are superior than women. And I think that is absolutely true for a number of different reasons. It's not necessarily that men are inherently smarter than women, although I do think men have certain aptitudes that women don't have, and vice versa. But it's how intelligence is applied and what you do with it, right? And so, like, a great example, like I run marathons. I've ran 11 marathons at this point. Like, that is abnormal for a lot of people, but that is specifically abnormal for women, because women aren't really the type of people who set goals and then achieve those goals and work towards goals. Like, you just look at like female culture, and it's women aren't typically high achievers. They lack discipline, they lack focus, they lack the ability to get stuff done. And I'm not saying that there aren't unique cases of women doing extraordinary things. Of course there are, but the vast majority of women are not going to go out and run one marathon, let alone 11. And it's just because they don't have the stamina. Frankly, they don't have the stamina to be able to do it. Like, it's not easy. And so that's why you see like endurance sports, for example, where a lot more men tend to dominate than women. And I think that's a great example of it. There just isn't the same level of dedication and focus and discipline within women's circles that exists within men, and then men are just naturally able to do. So I think that's why there's a bias of men being able to do different things and excel in certain things and be very good at it. Like, you'll never see a female equivalent of Elon Musk, I don't think. Like, I think that's highly unlikely. And I think that's another really good example. So that was kind of like the argument he was making. But there were women who were apparently at this conference, and they blabbed, it was off the record, but they blabbed what he said to the press and then threw a hissy fit about it. So this essay opens up talking about cancel culture and the cancellation of the president of Harvard. And Helen makes the point, the essay argued that it wasn't just that women had canceled the president of Harvard, it was that they'd canceled him in a very feminine way. They made emotional appeals rather than logical arguments. And you think about the timing of this, right? This was right after Me Too and this whole new culture that had emerged where you could just make all sorts of emotional appeals and gain sympathy from the court of public opinion. And all sorts of men, publicly and privately, have been accused of crimes that they never committed. You have women who retroactively rescinded consent and then cried foul. You had all this is happening, in 2017 and onwards. And this seems to be a good example of that kind of environment, but just applied to a professional setting where, a man said something a group of women disagreed with. And so the option and the path they took, rather than confront him or engage in discourse and dialogue, which is more of a masculine trait, they decided to go to the press and rely on the zeitgeist of that period of time and cancel him, and he had to step down. She says this cancellation was feminine, the essay argued, because all cancellations are feminine. Cancel culture is simply what women do whenever there are enough of them in a given organization or field. That is the Great Feminization thesis, which is the same author later elaborated upon at book length. Everything you think of as wokeness is simply an epiphenomenon of democratic feminization. So essentially, this person is arguing wokeness is not a new ideology. It's not an outgrowth of Marxism or a result of post-Obama disillusionment. It is simply feminine patterns of behavior applied to institutions where women were few in numbers until recently. So basically, women have changed the demographics within a number of different institutions within society. So this is looking specifically at academia and leadership within academia. But because women used to be a minority and now they're at parity, if not a majority, there are enough women on board with actions like cancellations where this has gained footing. So what was not permissible in a male-dominated environment is now permissible because there's enough women within these organizations who are willing to go along with it, and they're willing to support actions that result in cancellation. So here she talks about how feminism has manifested. So she says, we when we think of like women making headway in professional settings, we think of the first woman to attend law school in 1869, the first woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court in 1880, or the first female Supreme Court justice in 1981. But what she's arguing with Great Feminization is that today women are 33% of judges in America and 63% of judges appointed by President Joe Biden. So rather than a minority of women being unique outliers, women are now supplanting men in institutions that have historically been dominated by men. And she gets into why this is important in a minute. But she says the same trajectory can be seen in many professions. A pioneering generation of women in the 1960s and 70s, increasing female representation through the 1980s and 90s, and gender parity finally arriving, at least in younger cohorts, in the 2010s or 2020s. So we've reached this point now where women are no longer a minority in their fields. They're dominating and they're controlling it, and now they're shaping how these institutions operate. And this is leading to feminization en masse, not just within these institutions, but because this is happening across the board in multiple sections of our society, it's becoming mainstream. So she gives a great example here, but she says, in 1974, only 10% of New York Times reporters were female. The New York Times staff became majority female in 2018, and today the female share is 55%. So you wonder why the New York Times has become so overtly biased, and it's always had bias. Not going to deny that, but I think within the last few years, the bias has become so undeniable. It's just, at least, maybe a decade ago, reading the New York Times, like, you could see the bias, but there were also kernels of truth within stories that were being reported. So you could kind of pick and choose what you want to glean from it. Now, I mean, they're completely reporting absolute falsehoods and just simply issuing corrections and thinking, they'll sweep things under the rug. And it doesn't matter. It's they've done this enough times where it's shaped the narrative and shaped what we think about reality. So I think that's a really important thing to take note of. This is, of course, not just at the New York Times. This is happening at editorial boards across the country. And so you wonder why the news has gotten so bad. Well, this could explain it. Okay, she says wokeness arose around the same time that many important institutions tipped demographically from majority male to majority female. Everything you think of as wokeness involves prioritizing the feminine over the masculine, empathy over rationality, safety over risk, cohesion over competition. I think this is definitely something people have, like, you can observe and you can look around and just obviously cancel culture, demands for inclusion, equity and inclusion, intersectionality, all of these concepts and ideas that weren't really around in I'd say like the 90s and the early 2000s are now dominant in offices and institutions across the country. The most relevant differences are not about institutions, but about groups. In my experience, individuals are unique, and you come across outliers who defy stereotypes every day. But groups of men and groups of women display consistent differences. And so this is what I was saying before. It's in the past, you had a small minority of women, so these were pioneering women who were making headway into certain professions, but they didn't have a dominant foothold where they could invoke change. But now you have large groups of women who are dominating, and they might not be, I think that the feminist narrative is, okay, well, there's still not enough female CEOs, fine, but there's enough women managing certain departments, managing HR, acting as gatekeepers within organizations, changing culture to mold around their view of the world, that it is having an impact. And then if one company does something and then 5 companies do something, suddenly all the companies have to do the same thing too. And so it creates like a contagion effect. So, 1 or 2 women doing something, not a big deal. But when you have large groups of women all kind of colluding together to invoke the same kind of change, whether they're conscious of it or not, it has a massive effect across the culture. Female group dynamics favor consensus and cooperation. Men order each other around, but women can only suggest and persuade. And that's a nature of biology and reality. Like, men can invoke the use of force in ways that women cannot and never have been able to and never will be able to. So this is, I think, natural evolutionary adaptation, and it's just the result of differences. Like, we are biologically different creatures. We have different strengths and we have different weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses of women is that we can't compete on strength. And so men have a monopoly on the use of force and violence in a way that women simply can't compete with. Any criticism or negative sentiment, if it is absolutely must be expressed, needs to be buried in layers of compliments. This is absolutely true. A lot of you who watch this, you're guys, so you wouldn't understand girl culture, but this is absolutely true. Again, I've said this in countless other videos. I highly recommend watching the original Mean Girls. You will see this play out time and time again, where the plastics, the main characters, they will shower people they despise with compliments, and there's always like an innuendo or like a double meaning in those compliments. You can see it in girl culture on Instagram and on TikTok. People will say things, girls will say things to one another, and if you're just like an objective dude, you might think it's a compliment, and you don't realize that they're actually like trying to take a dig at the girl. And so girl culture is incredibly mean, but this is absolutely true. Like, you can't just say what you mean. Like, you have to beat around the bush and say things in a way to get it across in a not so mean way. And if you have wives or girlfriends, you've probably experienced this with them too. The outcome of a discussion is less important than the fact that a discussion was held and everyone participated in it. The most important sex difference in group dynamics is attitude to conflict. In short, men wage conflict openly, while women covertly undermine or ostracize their enemies. This is a thesis that was presented by an Australian psychologist named Dr. Danny Sulikowski. I've covered her as well in a separate video. But she calls it manipulative reproductive suppression, where elite women at the top have essentially distilled antinatalist views down to lower women socioeconomically beneath them, to reduce competition in the mating market. So rules for thee, not for me. So you'll have women at the top, feminist women, who will talk about how awful it is to have kids, how climate change is going to make it so that the world is uninhabitable, how Trump is awful and therefore you can't have kids. But they're having kids, right? They are the ones, they still have their kids, they're living their lives, they acknowledge their privilege, whether that's socioeconomic or whatever. They still have kids, but they're telling younger generations, younger women in lower socioeconomic positions not to have children. And you see this playing out right now. You see this with Gen Z women who are like, no, I'm not going to have children. They see children not only as a burden, but there's a moral hazard to having children because they think it's irresponsible because of the way the world is going right now. So that is absolutely true. Women will covertly undermine or ostracize one another and their enemies in order to get ahead. And it's done very subtly. It's very subtle. Okay. So she goes in to talk about, she talks about Barry Weiss here in her resignation, but she also says that men tend to be better at compartmentalizing than women, and wokeness was in many ways a society-wide failure to compartmentalize. Traditionally, an individual doctor might have opinions on the political issues of the day, but he would regard it as his professional duty to keep those opinions out of the examination room. Now that medicine has become more feminized, doctors wear pins and lanyards expressing views on controversial issues from gay rights to Gaza. And again, you can observe this. This is a trend that has certainly changed over time. I mean, remember growing up, right? Growing up in the 90s and 2000s, you would never discuss like politics, or even in the workforce, right? Even when I started, I started my career in 2014, and there was still a degree of professionalism. I think things were starting to change, but there was still like a degree of professionalism where you weren't like openly advocating specific political positions within the office. And now like things have completely changed. And I notice this too. Like I notice when I go to the doctor or where I'm places and I see the liberal getup, multicolored hair, the septum piercing, egregious glasses, the whole 9 years. I see that and I immediately understand where that person is coming from and that they are not a friend of mine and I need to tread with caution. But I've also noticed this too with regard to lanyards and pins and stuff, going to the doctor and seeing that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, this person, just based on how they're expressing themselves, they might not be in a position to give me the best care or the best professional advice, and I need to tread with caution. And that has, I think that's absolutely changed. It was never like that before, and now it is. So she cites a couple books in this essay. So one is Warriors and Worriers, A Survival of the Sexes by psychology professor Joyce Benenson. And in that book, she theorizes that men develop group dynamics optimized for war, while women develop group dynamics optimized for protecting their offspring. And I think this is true. And people who study evolutionary biology have come to the same conclusions. Like men and women are hardwired for very different things. And it stems from how we first existed in society. So you go back to hunter-gatherer societies all the way up to present. Like we are hardwired for certain things based on the biological role we are supposed to play. Like there's a reason why women are more nurturing and they're more, I say, polite and want to avoid violence. And this is why like women need to protect their offspring, their kids, whereas the men are the ones who are more or less disposable, to put it bluntly, and they will go fight a war. Women, that's not necessarily the case, and so we've just naturally like become hardwired for different roles in society. Females, even in primate species, are slower to reconcile than males, and this is a big issue. That is because women's conflicts were traditionally within the tribe over scarce resources to be resolved not by open conflict, but by covert competition with rivals with no clear terminus. Again, you just just observe girl culture, observe how mean girls are to one another. So I gave you Mean Girls as an example of a mood watch. But if you weren't following the e-girl drama on Twitter like a month or two ago, I mean, that's another great example. You had a bunch of conservative women who were like just being absolutely catty after one of the women had posted an engagement photo, and a couple others just like got into the comments and were just absolutely mean and vicious to this girl. She's just like, happy she got engaged, and the other women in the comments were just completely awful to one another. So this is across the board. This isn't just like liberal, woke, feminist women. Like all women do this. This is a thing, and women are wired for covert competition. We're not wired for war. We do it in very subtle ways, and we can do it through engineering the culture. So Dr. Sulikowski's manipulative reproductive suppression thesis would be an example of that. So she says here, if wokeness really is a result of the Great Feminization, then the eruption of insanity in 2020 was just a small taste of what the future holds. Imagine what will happen as our remaining men age out of these society-shaping professions and the younger, more feminized generations take full control. She says here, you might not be a journalist, but you live in a country where what gets written in the New York Times determines what is publicly accepted as the truth. If the Times becomes a place where in-group consensus can suppress unpopular facts more so than it already does, that affects every citizen. Let me give you a fantastic example of this. I recently wrote about this on Substack. I think this is really important. So I wrote about the Holodomor. If you're not familiar with the Holodomor, it was a man-made famine that happened in the early 1930s in the Soviet Union, but it was specifically targeted against folks in Ukraine. And so it was the result of deliberate policies by Joseph Stalin to effectively strip the Ukrainian countryside of food resources. So everyone was required to produce food, ship it to Moscow. They would do what they needed with it. So in some cases, they fed workers with it. In some cases, they exported abroad for profit. It didn't matter what happened to the food. All that mattered is that it left the countryside. And because the farmers weren't able to keep up with the arbitrary quotas imposed on them by central planners in Moscow, they couldn't meet their quotas. They couldn't create stores of food for bad times, and then they were penalized for it, right? So the Soviet Union would come in and they'd say, okay, you didn't make this quota, we're going to take your livestock now. So it got to a point where by 1930, there were rampant food shortages. People in Ukraine didn't have food, and then because the Soviet government in Moscow was terrified of nationalist uprisings, specifically amongst the Ukrainian population, many of who had been kind of wealthy private farmers in the pre-Soviet period. They had their farms stripped from them, and so they had a lot of resentment towards the government. There was fear that they would rise up, and so they essentially sealed the borders of Ukraine, turned it into an open concentration camp, and the death toll is unknown, but there are some estimates it was upwards of 10 million people. So it's what I personally would consider and call the other Holocaust. Like, this is something of tremendous importance and impact on how the rest of the 20th century turned out, because it just shaped the events that would happen in the next decade, right? Like, our entire understanding here in the West of the Soviet Union and how things played out during World War II was shaped by the fact that the Holodomor was not acknowledged in the press. And one of the reasons it was not acknowledged is because it was deliberately suppressed by the New York Times, which is the paper of record, which is basically the historical record of Western civilization, one of the papers of record that establishes the historical record. And that's because the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, I don't know if he was getting kickbacks from Stalin. I don't know if it was like his own personal agenda. Like, I can't say for certain why he did what he did. But there was a young 20-something man who had snuck into Ukraine, essentially, and had documented starvation with his own eyes, filed reports in the press, and the New York Times bureau chief in Moscow effectively suppressed publication of those articles, said that the journalist Gareth Jones had no credibility. The Moscow bureau chief, Walter Duranty, had previously won a Pulitzer Prize, so he just had more credibility. He had obviously a reputation as a journalist, but he used his position for whatever reason to suppress news of the Holodomor, of the starvation that was happening, discredited any accounts that got out, which a lot of reporting didn't get out because very few people witnessed it. Gareth Jones was probably one of the only few outsiders who witnessed it. And so our entire understanding of that period of time is shaped solely by this event, by the fact that a mass starvation event was suppressed in the media. People didn't know it. And so when World War II kicked off, the United States and the West, so, Great Britain as well, they looked at the options. You had Stalin and you had Hitler. So to them, Stalin was the lesser of two evils. So the United States and the West sided with Stalin and, as you know, defeated Hitler. Well, in reality, if you look at the body count and you look at how each ran their government and what they did to the people under their control, Stalin and Hitler were both two really bad people. I think, in an alternate history, like, the option would have been to not side with either. But if you don't know what you don't know, and if you only know positive stories that are coming out about the Soviet Union, if you're sitting here in the United States in the 1930s, you're going to pick him over Hitler, because what Hitler did, presumably from that perspective, was far worse. And you had no comparison, no knowledge, because again, this was the early 1930s. It's not like there was the internet. You couldn't just, look and fact check things for yourself. So that's just one example. But more recent stuff, obviously, like how COVID was covered and that kind of thing. You can see how the New York Times and publications like it are shaping the information environment that we live in today. And so if you want to know why leftists seem to think every single person who criticizes the left is a fascist, Nazi, white supremacist, I mean, look no further than the New York Times and how they're publishing information. But I mean, if they did this in the 1930s, like, of course they're going to do it again. And it's only going to get worse if this feminization thesis is correct, which I suspect it is, that more and more women have taken control over editorial positions and journalistic positions, and they are going to shape the news in a way that suits their interests and their agenda, not necessarily for the betterment of the public writ large. But the thing that she talks about here that I think I agree is most alarming is the rule of law. She says all of us depend on a functioning legal system, and to be blunt, the rule of law will not survive the legal profession becoming more majority female. The rule of law is not just about writing rules down. It means following them, even when they yield an outcome that tugs at your heartstrings or runs contrary to your gut sense of which party is more sympathetic. And we've already seen this happen. Like, how many criminals with 10, 15, 20, 30 felonies have been let go time and time again, and the only reason why they finally get caught is because they murder someone. Like, this continues to happen. The Irina Zaritska murder in Charlotte is an obvious example of this. Like, there was a female judge who believed in second chances, who gave her killer every single time he went through he got arrested and was convicted of stuff. He was let go, and eventually he killed someone. And so that's like the reality of it. And so it's not even just like criminals are being allowed to roam freely on the streets. It's that now average everyday people are starting to recognize that there is no justice in the criminal justice system. It's very much politically and ideologically motivated right now. And so there's a loss of trust in those institutions, which I think is more detrimental than the inability of those institutions to function in and of themselves. Okay, she says here, judges will bend the rules for favored groups and enforce them rigorously on disfavored groups, as already occurs to a worrying extent. And of course, definitely, like I said, we're seeing this happen already. The Great Feminization is truly unprecedented. Other civilizations have given women the vote, granted them property rights, or let them inherit the thrones of empires. No civilization in human history has ever experimented with letting women control so many vital institutions of our society, from political parties to universities to our largest businesses. So this is a social experiment we're living through in real time right now. This has never been done before. So even though you have women who were leaders of countries, like, you never had women, for example, like, control like religious institutions. You never had like a woman control the entirety of the church. You never had, women controlling the medical establishment or the legal profession. You never had like women, and not like women at the top, like rank and file, right? Like, you never had rank and file, middle management level women calling the shots in a way that you're seeing today. So she says here, the problem is not that women are less talented than men, or even that female modes of interaction are inferior in any objective sense. The problem is that female modes of interaction are not well suited to accomplishing the goals of many major institutions. And that is absolutely true. Like if your goal is to, uncover facts, and those facts contradict your feelings or the ideology that you believe in, like, there's going to be an inherent conflict of interest there. And I think, as she points out here, like, men are more objective. They will pursue truth regardless of how it impacts them. Women are more emotional. Women will bend to the whim of whatever they're feeling. And you see this in the culture around us right now. Okay, she says, feminization is not an organic result of women outcompeting men. It is an artificial result of social engineering. The most obvious thumb on the scale is anti-discrimination law. It is illegal to employ too few women at your company. If women are underrepresented, especially in your higher management, that is a lawsuit waiting to happen. As a result, employers give women jobs and promotions they would not otherwise have gotten simply in order to keep their numbers up. So basically, we are living through this moment of wokeness as a result of the increased feminization of institutions in our society. And those institutions are becoming more feminized because of anti-discrimination efforts, DEI, however you want to cast it. But these efforts to give more women opportunities, whether they deserve it or not. And again, like this has been happening. Like you, as a woman, like you have a better shot of getting a job in certain industries than if you are, a less advantaged young man from Appalachia. It's just, the reality of it. And so this is the problem is we've eroded meritocracy so that the best qualified people aren't getting jobs. It's the people that, suit the current political environment and check all the right boxes. Okay, it says women, this is a really good point. Women can sue their bosses for running a workplace that feels like a fraternity house, but men can't sue when their workplace feels like a Montessori kindergarten. So there's an inequitable application of rules and norms within, and this is specifically within workplaces. This is absolutely true. Like women can get away with anything. Like women can accuse, and you've seen this, right, in the post-Me Too era. Like women can accuse their bosses of harassment and they have to leave the company, step down, whatever, tarnishes their career. Women can demand, DEI initiatives and certain things to be implemented within the culture. And that usually, has to happen. But men can't demand other things in return. And if they do, that they're cast as evil misogynist, right? That they're part of the patriarchy. And so this is an example, and this is true. Like, women have all the right in the world to blame men and take legal action and financial recourse if they believe they're being harassed or they're in a toxic work environment. But men can't do the same thing against women. So it's a one-way street. Okay. So she's goes on to say that women are driving men away by imposing feminine norms on previously male institutions. So it's not even at this point just that like women are out competing men, and that's like the feminist narrative, right? It's like, okay, well women are in these positions because they're better than men, and this is proof that they're better than men because they're in these positions, like circular logic. It's that women are in these positions because they check the right boxes of anti-discrimination, and in becoming the majority within these institutions, men no longer want to play. Like men don't want to participate. One, because they're disadvantaged, right? Like they're not going to get promotions. They know it. They're like, if it's a choice between, a woman and a guy, especially if the woman also checks other boxes, maybe she's black, maybe she's LGBTQ, whatever. If she checks another DEI box, she's definitely going to get the promotion. He's not. So it's like, dudes are like, why would I work if I'm not going to get rewarded? So they're not, and of course they don't want to deal with like female culture. Like I say this as a woman, like I hate female culture. Women are awful. Women are catty. Women are petty. So I like do not like shame men who don't want to play in that game either. It's awful. And so it's driving men away. Like they don't want to work in an environment that is overwhelmingly female. And so she says that this is still a controversial opinion. She presented this at the National Conservative Conference. And she said, even in conservative circles, so circles that promote traditional values and traditional gender norms, to say that there are too many women in a given field or that women in large numbers can transform institutions beyond recognition in ways that make them cease to function well. So even acknowledging that this is a problem is still controversial for too many people. So she says, most people think wokeness is over, slain by the vibe shift, but if wokeness is the result of demographic feminization, then it will never be over as long as the demographics remain unchanged. And I think it's going to get worse, right? Because this isn't just being applied to women, right? We're seeing it applied to other categories of people. So we're seeing it on the basis of race. So you'll see with DEI stuff. You're seeing it on the basis of your sexual orientation. I'm sure something else will come up after that. So you're seeing all these different categories where people are looking to... people are demanding ascension into roles and institutions and privileges that they haven't earned and they're not necessarily competent for, but based on the box they check, they think that they're entitled to those positions. So she concludes by saying, thankfully, I don't think solving the feminization problem requires us to shut any doors in women's faces. And I agree, like there are always going to be outliers, and women who are willing and able to compete can and I don't think we should take that away from women. But she says here, we simply have to restore fair rules. Right now, we have a nominally meritocratic system in which it is illegal for women to lose. So the game is rigged. The game is rigged in the favor of women in this specific case, but also other groups of people as well. So it's rigged in favor of some groups of people and against men. And so that is fundamentally transforming how our society functions, and it's led to this eruption of wokeness. So she's arguing that we have to restore meritocracy, and I think that is absolutely the case. And this is one of the reasons I said in the beginning, like, I run marathons. One of the reasons I love running is because it is a meritocratic sport. Like, it's all about you. You put in the effort, you train, you eat right. Like, you get the outcomes based on the inputs you put into it. Like, you're not really dependent on anyone else. It's all up to you. And it is an even playing field. Like, yeah, like, I run alongside men, sure. I'm not competing against them. Like, I'm competing against myself. And so that's why, like, I love running, because it is truly a meritocratic sport. But I can see, like, how that has eroded, especially in professional settings. And so one of the things she says is, you gotta remove the HR lady's veto power. I think people will be surprised to discover how much of our current feminization is attributable to institutional changes like the advent of HR, which were brought about by legal changes and which legal changes can reverse. So yeah, I mean, and we'll see if AI has anything to do with this. A lot of HR departments are getting wiped out right now thanks to AI. But yeah, I mean, I think people underestimate the power of HR within companies, and I think in a lot of cases it's more powerful than the CEO, and that is like a gatekeeping entity within a company that determines how that company functions. So yeah, I think there's definitely some merit to this thesis. I think it's interesting because this isn't necessarily feminism. It's not about feminism. It's not blaming feminism, the political ideology. It's blaming feminization, which is a demographic shift within institutions and places that hold power and influence over society. So I think that's an important caveat to the conversation, because a lot of people, myself included, like, haven't really thought of this before, but I can definitely see how feminism or feminization got us to wokeness, not necessarily feminism, which I think, a lot of us have been blaming up until now. But yeah, this is a fantastic piece. It was in a publication called Compact, and it's called The Great Feminization. I would love to know what you think, especially if you're in an environment that is dominated by women, or over a period of time, you've seen the demographic transition from one that was more dominated by men to one that's more dominated by women. I would be really curious to know if you've observed this happening and what you think, what your experience has been and how this has affected you in your profession. I would love to hear stories about this. Definitely share your thoughts in the comments below. I appreciate you for watching this. If you got anything out of this and really found this to be insightful, I'd love it if you'd like and subscribe. Share it with folks in your network, because like I said, this is a really interesting thesis that, if it's correct, would help understand the current political climate we are in right now. It's not just Marxist ideology. It's not just Democrats versus Republicans. I think there's, it's a lot deeper than that. And then there's a lot of aspects of evolutionary biology at play, and biological differences, and just inherent gender differences that we are failing to appreciate and acknowledge, the extent to which that those things are impacting society at scale. So definitely share it. And like I said, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.